So the title of the short session is quite grandly called State of the Sector. Then I'm going to say something briefly about the external threats to higher education in Australia, and lastly just something about the role and regulatory posture of TEQSA as the regulator itself. We tend in this country to beat ourselves up a fair bit, but we should actually reflect on the strength we have in the Australian higher education system. We went into COVID, a well-regarded system internationally, with pretty good metrics to demonstrate that strength. And notwithstanding the manifold challenges, we've actually come out of COVID, or we are coming out of COVID in a slightly halting manner, in a reasonably robust place, though there are variations in the sector. It's also worth just clarifying for a moment that, of course, when we talk about higher education in Australia, we are, of course, talking about the universities, typically very established and large institutions, and higher education enrolments in Australia are predominated, of course, by the universities. But we have a new group, the university colleges, of which we have 5 members, and we also have about 140 institutes of higher education. And a fair bit of the growth that is anticipated to occur in the next decade or so won't necessarily be occurring in the university side of the equation. It'll be occurring in some of the new bodies, whether they be general in focus or quite specialist. It's also worth reflecting when you think of the vast challenges that we have faced in some, for example, in some of the typical universities. Think of the challenge that Liz Hughes has got at the National Institute of Dramatic Arts in the sort of changeover, the sudden and abrupt changeover that she had to deal with, and she's of course one of our speakers today. Despite the challenges of COVID, I think we should reflect on some dividends that have been associated with it. We've seen governments respond pretty quickly and pretty significantly. We've seen institutions respond. I hope the regulator has sought to respond. But we've also seen students having to respond and having to adapt to the circumstances. I might also add that through the Quilt Survey and a whole lot of other things, the students have let us all know how well we're going. And I think that advice that comes through from the student body and is indeed reflected in the role and significance that we give to students in this sort of conference shows that we need to listen carefully to that therapeutic advice. The sector, though, is dynamic. A reference has been made to the review being led by Mary O'Kane, and thanks very much, Jenny, for being here this morning. That review is going to take a lot of attention and a lot of energy over the next year or so. It's not the only review occurring, but it will be a significant one in terms of guiding the landscape ahead. Clearly there's unfinished business around participation in Australia. Targets for participation have been met broadly in metropolitan Australia, but the further away you get from the metropolitan centres, so the challenges remain profound. The relationship between higher education and the vet sector also was mentioned by Jason Clare this morning, and I think we should look at that relationship not so much through institutional eyes, but through the eyes of the students who are experiencing that sector, and we might come back to that a little bit later. The other brief point under this heading I just mentioned is a theme that the Minister's also mentioned today, just the rising concern around the safety of our physical places and our virtual spaces, both for staff and students. And that, of course, extends into much broader questions of well-being. The second slide relates to the external threats to Australian higher education: quality, sustainability and integrity. The panel that you've just been listening to has actually touched on these. I guess the point I would make is that, or underline, is that we do live in a world where the scale and frequency of major disruptions is going in only one direction. And that does require unprecedented capacity to adapt and to sustain and to think and behave more than laterally. And the other thing to just say about these is that they're all connected. We tend to think, I'm always worried when I watch television news and they talk about weather events. They quite often don't connect it to climate. But there are all sorts of other connections, of course, with health and migration and economy and productivity. And so I guess the role of the higher education sector, in a sense, is also to help the community through these massive transitions, uncomfortable transitions, and hopefully we over the years will be up to that. Very specifically for our purposes, and I guess this provides a bit of a guide to TEQSA's priorities, is to focus on the major threats to Australian higher education. One of them became very apparent during the early period of COVID and stays with us. That is that it relates to that very successful part of Australian higher education, the international higher education interests of our universities, the capacity for Australia to attract large numbers of international students, provide them with a good education, and those students will go back as graduates and leaders to their own countries, and that is very important for the countries. It's also very important in terms of the relationships we have across countries. But I think as we come out of, as I said haltingly, as we come out of COVID, we also see that we can't afford to return to the model of single source campus-based higher education, which has been so successful to date. We're not abandoning it. What we're recognising is that perhaps our model of Australian international higher education in the future will more resemble the sort of mixes and models that have been tried with success elsewhere. It does raise some interesting questions about what an Australian higher education degree might be and might look like, and I think they're good questions for us to continue discussion about. We are very concerned as a regulator, and as many of you undoubtedly are, with some of the corroding elements or the corroding influences that are part of our society and certainly penetrate our institutions from time to time. The issue of industrial scale academic cheating has already been called out by the Minister this morning. Cyber security vulnerabilities have been alluded to, and the one that hasn't been touched upon, but which is very bothersome, are all the questions around admission practices in circumstances where they lack integrity and transparency. I just add by way of footnote, it's not a matter that is something. It's not a matter that's being focused on by TEQSA, but is certainly being focused on by Margaret Shields' review that's occurring at present. It relates to research misconduct, if you like, research misconduct writ large, particularly around misrepresentation of research findings and the damage that can do science and education. We understand the progress of discovery, and it involves experimentation, it involves mistakes. But we've had some very worrying cases in this country, as have occurred elsewhere, where I think science's name has been imperilled. I'd also add to that that it's never just the individual scientists involved. It's quite often large teams of people that are involved, as well as, of course, a spread of reputational damage. The very last slide I'd like to make a comment on relates to the role and regulatory posture of TEQSA itself. We've been through a 30-year journey. It started off in Australia, the whole move toward regulation started off with the difficulties around Greenwich University, the online provider that proposed for Norfolk Island a long time ago. We've been through the national protocols, also understand and respect that there are different traditions underpinning the development of regulation in the vet sector compared to the higher education sector. But in a sense, the model that was introduced about 10 or 12 years ago is, if you like, a command and control model. It's one that we actually don't think is entirely sustainable. In fact, in our honest moments, we worry about collapsing under the weight of our own regulatory machinery. But what I am signalling, and it's not a matter that requires legislative change, but we'd certainly like government endorsement, and I think that's implied already in many of the things that have been said, is that we do need to have a more engaged model of interaction with all of our institutions, providers as we call them in a TEQSA sort of way, with the respective responsibilities of the regulator, of government, of institutions themselves in assuring quality, in assuring quality and good outcomes. It does require TEQSA itself to show some leadership. I remember the first meeting I had in this role with Minister. We talked about what would be the worst question a minister could ask the regulator in our sector. And we sort of agreed that the question would be, why the hell didn't TEQSA tell us what was going on? And that sort of implies, I think, an obligation for us to seek to be as prescient as we can be and to put a focus on guidance. TEQSA, like any organisation, is full of humans and it makes mistakes. But I think we've got to be very careful about the balance that we have between those activities in which we are checking on things and, if you like, assuring ourselves of things and looking ahead at the challenges that might come through. I think in a couple of areas we've done it well. I think with the efforts of colleagues at TEQSA, Helen Ganil and her team, we've done a lot in respect of industrial scale cheating, because the early alerts started there in 2017. We've probably been slower in some other areas, and we've developed a practice over the years of developing guidance notes. And I say about guidance notes, and I think we've all got the message, that there should be two characteristics of the guidance notes that TEQSA provides. One is that they should be notes, and two, they should provide guidance. And that does imply pithiness and brevity and clarity. It also should imply a capacity to continually revise that which you're doing, because sometimes we've done that well, and I think sometimes we've perhaps not done it so well. With all of that, I think we've got to think about the tone. A regulator shouldn't be known for its coziness with providers, because questions of capture might be raised. But I do often think about the tone and manner of our dealings, and indeed sometimes the tone and manner of dealings of institutions with us. But we have our own little idiosyncrasies at TEQSA. Yesterday I received my new ID card at TEQSA, and it has my photograph on it, which is very nice, has my name on it. Doesn't have anything, I'm sure it'll come, doesn't have anything to do with TEQSA. I'm simply called a contractor. Now, I've got nothing against contractors, but I guess that's my identity crisis and not yours. I think an area that we're all seeking to do better is to understand the authentic student voice. And of course, the authentic student voice combines many, many hundreds of different styles of student, mode of engagement they have with physical and virtual spaces, with a huge range of differing demands, with huge variations in their expectations. We are seeking, one of our two roles is to protect and look after the interests of students. We take it enormously seriously, I think, and I hope it's reflected in today's program. The last comment that I would make, though, in completing is just to simply say our essential role remains unchanged. Our role is to seek to do whatever we can to help protect and build further the quality of Australia's higher education sector in the broadest sense, and it's also to protect the interests of students. And I hope we keep focused on those two. Thank you very much.